What does it take for a man to cross the threshold of morality? How does someone revered for his compassion and guidance find himself at the center of a crime so heinous it defies comprehension? A preacher, a man who stood before a congregation every Sunday, calling for love, forgiveness, and unity, would one day be remembered not for his sermons, but for the shocking discovery that shattered his world. It began with whispers, faint and fleeting, in the back of his mind. Whispers that grew louder, more insistent, refusing to be silenced. At first, it was easy to dismiss, a trick of the imagination perhaps, or the fleeting remnants of a bad dream. But doubts have a way of lingering, of planting themselves deep in the psyche, where they fester and grow until they demand to be acknowledged. This man, known to his flock as a shepherd of righteousness, a pillar of strength in his community, could no longer ignore the questions that kept him awake at night. Questions about his children, their faces, their mannerisms, the little things he once overlooked but now seemed impossible to explain. Were they truly his? Was his life, the life he had built with his wife, the family he cherished, what it appeared to be? The idea seemed absurd at first, even unthinkable. After all, he had devoted his life to this family, sacrificed for them, loved them. The thought of something being amiss was almost too painful to consider, but the doubts persisted, and with them came an unsettling need to know the truth, no matter the cost. And so, he made a decision that, in hindsight, would set off a series of events that could never be undone. A simple DNA test, a routine procedure meant to confirm his peace of mind, became the key that unlocked a Pandora's box of unimaginable revelations. When the results came back, they confirmed the very thing he had been too afraid to voice aloud. His 5 children, his pride, his joy, the very center of his world, were not biologically his. Each of them carried the unmistakable genetic signature of someone else, someone he knew, someone he trusted, his brother. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The weight of the truth crashed down upon him with a force that was almost physical, leaving him reeling, breathless, unable to comprehend the enormity of what he had just discovered. The man he had grown up with, the man he had shared his childhood with, the man he called his brother, was the biological father of his children. Questions flooded his mind, each more unbearable than the last. How long had this been going on? How could his wife, the woman he had loved, the woman he had vowed to protect, betray him in such a profound and unforgivable way? How could his brother do this to him? The sense of betrayal ran so deep, it cut to the very core of his being. He thought of the years he had spent raising these children, the sacrifices he had made, the memories they had shared. Birthdays, holidays, milestones, all of it suddenly felt like a cruel joke, a facade built on lies. He thought of the moments he had turned to his wife for comfort, for partnership, for love, never suspecting that she harbored a secret so devastating it would destroy everything they had built together. And his brother, the man who had always been there, always been part of the family, always been someone he thought he could trust. How long had he been watching, waiting, taking what wasn't his to take? It wasn't just anger that consumed him. It was humiliation, despair, and a deep, gnawing sense of loss. The life he thought he knew was gone, shattered in an instant. And as the days turned into nights and the nights into days, those emotions began to transform into something else entirely. What happens to a man when everything he has built, everything he believes in, is taken from him in such a cruel and deliberate way? How does he reconcile the man he thought he was with the man he is becoming? For this preacher, a man whose life had been dedicated to guiding others toward peace, the answer came not in prayer or forgiveness, but in an act so horrifying, so grotesque, it would send shockwaves through his community and leave investigators questioning how such a crime could come from a man of faith. The crime itself would defy belief, not just in its brutality, but in the cold, calculated way it unfolded. A man once known for his calm demeanor, his measured words, and his devotion to his faith would become the focus of headlines around the world. He had preached love and understanding, but in the face of this unimaginable revelation, he found himself consumed by something entirely different. And when it was over, When the rage had subsided and the act had been carried out, the preacher's name would forever be associated not with the sermons he gave or the community he served, but with the unspeakable tragedy that unfolded in the wake of a single, life-altering truth. Welcome back to Echoes of Crime, where the past speaks and the truth demands to be heard. I'm honored to have you here as we delve into another gripping case. To my returning subscribers, thank you for your unwavering support. It means the world to me. If you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you'll never miss a story. For years, he was the man the community turned to in times of need. Whether it was a sermon to soothe troubled hearts or a helping hand to those in crisis, the preacher was a beacon of light in Houston's quiet suburbs. His church was a sanctuary, his family an example of everything good and right. His sermons spoke of love, trust, and forgiveness, and his words carried a weight that resonated with everyone who heard them. At home, the image seemed equally perfect. His wife was deeply involved in church activities, always by his side, smiling and gracious. Their 5 children were lively and well-behaved, the kind of family that drew admiration from neighbors and friends. Together, they attended community picnics, charity drives, and church socials, always appearing united and strong. Then there was his brother, quieter, more reserved, yet always present. He wasn't as involved in the church, but he showed up to family events, sharing in their lives from the edges. He wasn't the man people noticed first in a room, but he was always there, blending into the background. The preacher welcomed him with open arms, proud to have family so close, and over the years his brother became an almost permanent fixture in their lives. The preacher's family was admired by the community, but admiration often masks the truth. In the stillness of his own home, questions began to creep into his mind. It wasn't one moment or one detail, but a series of small observations that seemed to defy explanation. He started noticing things, subtle differences in the children. A certain way one of them laughed that felt unfamiliar. A resemblance here, a mannerism there. Details that didn't align with what he believed to be true. At first, he dismissed these thoughts, brushing them aside as overthinking or the stress of leading a busy congregation. But doubts are persistent, and they rarely fade without answers. The preacher began to feel an unease he couldn't shake. He started watching more closely, studying their faces, their gestures, the small quirks that made them unique, and with each passing day, the questions in his mind grew louder. His wife remained oblivious to his internal turmoil, or perhaps she simply chose not to notice. She went about her days as she always had, caring for the children, supporting her husband, and fulfilling her role in the church. But to the preacher, every interaction became a puzzle piece. Every glance, every word, every touch seemed weighted with unspoken meaning. Eventually, the questions became too much. He needed answers, not assumptions. He convinced himself that a DNA test would silence his doubts, that the results would bring him peace and allow him to move forward. It was a practical decision, or so he told himself. The process was straightforward, but waiting for the results was agonizing. He found himself alternating between hope and dread, desperate for the truth, but terrified of what it might reveal. And when the results finally came, they were far worse than anything he could have imagined. All 5 children, not one, not 2, every single one of them. The results were clear and undeniable. The children he had loved, raised, and cherished as his own were not biologically his. Each of them carried the DNA of his brother. In that moment, the world as he knew it crumbled. The home he had built, the family he had poured his heart and soul into, the life he had worked so hard to create, it all felt like a cruel illusion. The truth hit him like a tidal wave, leaving him gasping for air, struggling to make sense of what he had just learned. He thought back to the moments he had shared with his brother, the trust he had placed in him, the bond they had shared since childhood. He thought about his wife, the woman he had stood beside at the altar, the woman he had trusted with his heart, and he thought about the children, the laughter, the milestones, the love he had felt for them, all of it tainted by a truth he could neither ignore nor accept. As the days passed, the preacher's mind became a storm of emotions. Anger, humiliation, confusion. They all fought for dominance, leaving him restless and volatile. He found himself replaying every interaction, every memory, searching for signs he had missed, clues he had overlooked. How had this gone unnoticed for so long? How had they managed to deceive him so completely? The tension in the house became almost unbearable. He could no longer look at his wife without seeing the lies she had told, the secrets she had kept. Her every word, her every gesture, felt like a mockery of the life they had built together. The children, once a source of joy, now served as constant reminders of the truth he wished he could escape. And yet he said nothing. To the outside world, everything appeared normal. He continued to preach, to lead his congregation, to offer comfort and guidance to those who sought his help. But inside, the weight of the truth was suffocating. He could feel the strain in every moment, in every breath, as if his very existence had become a lie. The preacher was a man of faith, a man who had spent his life teaching others to forgive, to love, to find strength in their beliefs. But faith has its limits, and so does forgiveness. The seeds of doubt and anger had been planted, and they began to grow unchecked and unrelenting. What happens when the very foundation of a man's life is ripped away? How does he reconcile the image he has projected to the world with the reality of what he feels inside? For the preacher, the answers to these questions would lead him down a path no one could have foreseen. As the days turned into weeks, the weight of the revelation pressed heavier on the preacher. It wasn't just a single betrayal or a fleeting moment of pain. It was the unraveling of everything he believed in, everything he had built. He began to question not only those around him, but himself as well. How had he missed it? How had he been so blind, so trusting, so vulnerable to the lies that had infiltrated his life? He became consumed by his thoughts, replaying conversations, memories, and moments with his wife and brother, searching for signs he had overlooked. Every smile, every embrace, every shared meal now felt tainted, stripped of its warmth and meaning. Even his faith, the cornerstone of his existence, began to feel hollow. The sermons he preached, the words he offered to his congregation, rang empty in his own ears. At the pulpit, he struggled to maintain the image of the man his community revered. His once uplifting messages began to shift in tone, growing harsher, more focused on morality, punishment, and consequence. Those closest to him noticed the change, but few dared to question it. To most, he was still the preacher, their guide, their leader. Yet those sitting in the pews began to feel the weight of his words. Sometimes, he said during one particularly charged sermon, "You must cut out the rot to let the soul heal. It is not an easy task, but it is necessary. For where there is sin, there can be no growth, no peace, no salvation." The words hung in the air, heavier than the congregation was used to. They nodded along, trusting his wisdom, even as the tone unsettled them. At home, the changes were more pronounced. The preacher, once calm and patient, became distant, his demeanor shifting from quiet reflection to abrupt outbursts of anger. He spent hours pacing the house, staring at nothing in particular, his mind far away. Conversations with his wife grew shorter, colder, more pointed. The warmth that once defined their relationship had been replaced by tension so thick it felt inescapable. His wife, sensing the growing distance, tried to reach him, but every attempt was met with silence or hostility. She began to confide in close friends, hinting that something was wrong, though she couldn't quite explain what. She spoke of his late nights, the way he stared through her as if she weren't even there, the way he seemed to bristle at the smallest interaction. Her friends offered comfort, assurances that it was just stress, that he would come around. None of them could have imagined what was coming. The preacher's actions became harder to ignore. He began making purchases that raised questions. A large chest freezer delivered to their home, heavy-duty trash bags, industrial-grade cleaning supplies. He claimed it was for household projects, an excuse that no one, not even his wife, truly believed. Neighbors began to notice changes too. The arguments between the preacher and his wife grew louder, more frequent, echoing through the usually quiet street. The once welcoming home, where laughter had often spilled out into the yard, now seemed to emanate something entirely different. Then came the night everything changed. It was late, the children already asleep, the house cloaked in an uneasy silence. The preacher had been unusually quiet all day, avoiding his wife's attempts at conversation. But that night something shifted. An argument broke out, louder, more intense than any before. Neighbors would later recall hearing raised voices, muffled but unmistakable. They heard her pleading, though the words were indistinct. Then there was silence. What happened next would only be pieced together after the fact, a timeline reconstructed from evidence and testimony. Inside the house, the confrontation had escalated beyond words. The preacher, driven by a storm of emotions, anger, humiliation, and a need for control, took actions that even he could never have imagined himself capable of. The hours that followed were a blur of movement, the kind of calculated precision that comes not from clarity, but from desperation. He worked quickly, methodically, ensuring that no trace would be left behind. Later that night, a neighbor noticed him loading something into his vehicle. The details were hazy, just the faint outline of a figure moving under the cover of darkness. There was no noise, no commotion, just the unsettling quiet that seemed to linger long after he was gone. When the house finally fell silent, it was a silence that carried with it the weight of what had been done. The preacher returned before dawn, his vehicle empty, his face unreadable. To those who saw him the next morning, he seemed the same as always, a man of faith, a leader, a father. But inside the house, the truth could not be ignored. The once vibrant home was now a hollow shell, its walls bearing witness to the events of the night before. And though the preacher tried to carry on, to return to his routine, the reality of his actions hung over him like a shadow, inescapable and unrelenting. For days, no one noticed her absence. It wasn't unusual for the preacher's wife to stay home while he attended to his congregation, or so people thought. But as days stretched into nearly a week, questions began to arise. Friends from the church called, neighbors knocked on the door, but their concerns were met with vague explanations. "She's visiting family," he said to one. "She's not feeling well," he told another. But the explanations couldn't silence the growing unease. Her close friends, the ones she had confided in about the tension at home, began to suspect that something was deeply wrong. She hadn't returned their calls, hadn't responded to their messages. They knew she wouldn't just leave without a word, without a sign. One of those friends, unable to ignore her instincts, decided to act. A call was placed to the police, and soon officers arrived at the preacher's home. He greeted them calmly, offering the same rehearsed explanation about his wife's absence. He was composed, even helpful, volunteering information about her supposed trip and insisting that there was nothing to worry about. But something didn't sit right with the officers. His demeanor, though outwardly polite, carried an edge they couldn't quite place. They asked to look around, and he obliged, leading them through the house with a forced air of cooperation. The house was quiet, unnaturally so. The children, usually lively and energetic, were subdued, their eyes downcast. The officers noted the peculiar silence but pressed on, searching for any sign of the missing woman. When they reached the garage, the temperature seemed to drop. It wasn't the weather or the structure, it was something else entirely. A large chest freezer sat against the wall, unassuming at first glance, but its presence loomed large in the officers' minds. They asked the preacher about it, and he hesitated for the first time. His composure faltered ever so slightly, his voice losing its practiced calmness. "It's just an old freezer," he said, "nothing special." But the officers insisted on opening it, their instincts urging them forward. What they found inside defied comprehension. The dismembered remains of his wife, carefully wrapped and hidden, lay frozen beneath the lid. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, the weight of the discovery pressing down on everyone in the room. The preacher's reaction was immediate: denial. He claimed ignorance, insisted that someone else must have done it, that he had no idea how she ended up there. His words came quickly, tumbling over one another in a frantic attempt to explain the unexplainable. But the evidence was undeniable. The marks on the tools in the garage, the cleaning supplies still sitting in plain sight, the inconsistencies in his story. It all pointed to one conclusion. Under pressure, the preacher's resolve began to crack. Eventually he confessed, though the words came slowly, haltingly, as if he couldn't quite believe them himself. He described the night of the confrontation, how his rage had consumed him, how the weight of the truth had pushed him to the breaking point. "I couldn't look at her," he said during his confession. "I couldn't look at her, knowing what she'd done to me, knowing what she and my own brother had done to my family." He spoke of the DNA test results, how they had shattered his world, how they had left him feeling hollow and betrayed. He described the arguments, the accusations, the moment he realized there was no way forward. And then he described the act itself, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, as if recounting the events of someone else's life. The investigators pressed him further, trying to understand the full scope of the crime. They asked about his brother, about whether he had been involved, about how much he knew. The preacher insisted that his brother had no idea, that he hadn't been complicit, that the betrayal had been his alone. But the investigators weren't convinced. They turned their attention to the brother, questioning him, probing for details, trying to determine the extent of his involvement. The brother, though shaken, denied everything. He claimed he had no idea the children were his, that he had never knowingly betrayed his sibling, that he had been as blindsided by the DNA results as anyone else. The tension between the two brothers became another layer to the tragedy. One accused the other of lying, of knowing more than he admitted. The other, desperate to clear his name, pointed to his own ignorance, insisting that he had been as much a victim of the circumstances as anyone else. And through it all, the children became the silent witnesses to a nightmare they couldn't escape. Their father's actions, their mother's death, their uncle's alleged involvement. It was too much for anyone to process, let alone children so young. The case, once it became public, sent shockwaves through the community. People who had once looked to the preacher for guidance, who had trusted him with their fears and confessions, now struggled to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the man he had become. His words, once a source of comfort, now took on a darker meaning. His sermons about justice and morality overshadowed by his actions. In the end, the preacher stood alone, his world reduced to the cold, unyielding walls of a prison cell. His brother, though cleared of any legal wrongdoing, would carry the weight of the scandal for the rest of his life, and the children, left without parents, would grow up in the shadow of a crime that defined their family. What drives a man to such extremes? What makes him cross the line between love and rage, between trust and destruction? These questions lingered long after the case was closed, unanswered, unanswerable, leaving only the chilling memory of what had been done. The arrest of the preacher sent shockwaves through the community. The man they had turned to for guidance, the man who had stood at the pulpit preaching love and forgiveness, was now in handcuffs, facing accusations that seemed too horrific to comprehend. The small Houston suburb, once a quiet and trusting place, became a national focal point overnight. Reporters descended on the area, cameras flashing, microphones thrust toward anyone willing to speak. Everyone wanted to know how this man, this trusted leader, could commit such an act. In the days following his arrest, details of the crime began to emerge, each one more chilling than the last. The police described the methodical nature of his actions, the calculated steps he had taken to cover his tracks. His calm demeanor during initial questioning was contrasted with the cold reality of what had been uncovered in his home. As the case moved to trial, the preacher's defense team attempted to shift the narrative. They claimed that he had acted out of temporary insanity, a moment of emotional collapse brought on by the unbearable weight of the DNA revelations. They argued that any man in his position, faced with such betrayal, could have snapped under the pressure. They painted him as a victim of his own circumstances, a man driven to the edge by forces beyond his control. But the prosecution painted a different picture. They described a man who had allowed his rage to fester, who had planned his actions with a precision that belied any claim of temporary insanity. They presented the evidence, the tools he had purchased, the freezer he had installed, the meticulous steps he had taken to hide what he had done. This was not the act of a man who had lost control, they argued. This was premeditation. The trial divided the community. Some, particularly those who had been closest to the preacher, defended him. They spoke of his years of service, his dedication to his faith, his role as a father and a leader. They argued that he was a good man who had been pushed to the brink by circumstances no one could endure. But others saw no excuse for his actions. They pointed to the brutality of the crime, the loss of a life, the irreparable damage done to his children. They called for the harshest punishment, insisting that no amount of emotional trauma could justify what he had done. The courtroom was packed every day, with spectators hanging on every word, every piece of testimony. The preacher himself remained largely silent, his demeanor subdued, his expressions unreadable. When asked to speak, his words were brief, his voice quiet. "I am sorry," he said once, though the words rang hollow in the face of everything that had happened. In the end, the jury found him guilty. The sentence was life in prison without the possibility of parole, a decision that brought some measure of closure to the community, but left others grappling with unanswered questions. As for the preacher's brother, his life was forever changed as well. Though he was not charged with any crime, the stigma of the case followed him wherever he went. He maintained that he had no knowledge of the DNA results, no idea that the children were his. But the court of public opinion was less forgiving. Some believed his claims while others saw him as complicit, a silent participant in the betrayal that had torn the family apart. The children, perhaps, bore the heaviest burden of all. In the span of days, they had lost both parents, their mother to death, their father to the justice system. They were placed in the care of extended family, but the scars of what they had endured would never fully heal. They grew up in the shadow of a crime that defined their family, their identities forever linked to the actions of their parents. The community, once united by faith and trust, found itself fractured. Neighbors who had shared meals and prayers now looked at one another with suspicion, wondering how well they truly knew the people around them. The church, once a place of solace and unity, struggled to recover, its congregation dwindling as members sought refuge elsewhere. The media, meanwhile, latched onto the case with relentless fervor. Headlines screamed about the preacher's fall from grace, the shocking betrayal, the gruesome details of the crime. Talk shows debated the morality of his actions, the role of faith in his downfall, the implications for his children. Books were written, documentaries produced, each one dissecting the case from every angle. The cultural impact of the case extended far beyond Houston. It sparked broader conversations about family, trust, and the consequences of unchecked anger. Experts weighed in on the psychological toll of betrayal, the fragile nature of identity, the ways in which secrets can fester and grow until they destroy everything they touch. But for those at the center of the tragedy, the case was not a topic for debate or analysis. It was their reality, a reality they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. The preacher, now serving his sentence in a maximum security prison, had nothing but time to reflect on his actions. His brother, trying to rebuild his life, faced an uphill battle against judgment and condemnation. And the children, caught in the crossfire of a tragedy they couldn't begin to understand, struggled to find a sense of normalcy in a world that had been irreversibly changed. In the end, the questions remained. How could something so horrific happen within a family that seemed so perfect? How could a man who had dedicated his life to faith and community be capable of such violence? And what does it say about the fragile nature of trust, the thin line between love and destruction, the choices that define us in our darkest moments? These questions lingered, unanswered, haunting the memories of everyone who had been touched by the case, a chilling reminder of the depths to which even the most trusted among us can fall. Families are often thought of as the safest haven, a place of trust, love, and understanding. But what happens when the very foundation of that family is built on secrets too painful to confront? What happens when the truths we hide from one another grow so large that they consume everything in their path? The tragedy of this case isn't just the crime itself. It's the slow unraveling of lives, the choices made long before that fateful night, and the weight of truths that were buried for far too long. This was a family that, from the outside, seemed to embody everything good and wholesome. But the cracks that formed beneath the surface, hidden by years of silence and denial, eventually grew into fractures that no one could mend. As horrifying as this crime was, it leaves us with questions that extend beyond the courtroom or the headlines. Could this have been prevented? Was there a moment, somewhere along the way, where this tragedy might have been avoided? Could the preacher's rage and despair have been tempered if he had sought help, if he had confided in someone, if he had confronted the truth in a different way? And what of the choices made before the crime? The decisions, the lies, the silences that led to this breaking point? The DNA test may have been the catalyst, but the seeds of this tragedy were planted long before. The betrayal he discovered may have been unbearable, but was it inevitable that it would end this way? Or could honesty, no matter how painful, have offered a path towards something other than destruction? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think justice was served? Was life in prison the right sentence? Or could there ever be true justice for such a crime? And more importantly, what can we learn from this case to prevent tragedies like this in the future? If this story has left you shaken, just wait until you hear what we're covering next week. A story of power, greed, and betrayal that spanned continents and brought down an empire. Make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss it. Thank you for watching, and as always, stay safe and stay vigilant.